The morning air was heavy with a silence that was anything but peaceful, the kind of silence that comes when the world has grown used to oppression. A thin shaft of light slipped through the tiny window high on the wall, so faint it could not drive away the shadows clinging to the room. In here, time seemed frozen, not because dawn had yet to fully break, but because each day began with the exact same scene, repeated like an unchanging ritual. The chamber was barely 10 square meters, its walls damp and stained with patches of mold, carrying the stench of wet earth and stale sweat. There were no decorations, no signs of care, only a low wooden bed with a thin blanket and a wobbly wooden table tucked into a corner. Occasionally, a few specks of dust drifted down from the ceiling, spinning lazily in the pale beam of light before disappearing into the darkness below. Outside, the city might be waking to the sound of roosters and the smell of fresh bread. But here, the day did not truly begin until the sound of metal rang out. The clank of the iron lock was more than the herald of an opening door. It was a reminder that every second of your life belonged to someone else. Our protagonist no longer remembered the last time they awoke without waiting for that sound. Once, mornings had meant opportunity. Now, they were simply another turn of the wheel, bringing them back to the same point. Trapped in a cycle that offered no escape. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, pierced only by the faint hiss of wind slipping through the doorframe. But this heaviness did not come solely from the room. It came from the system outside. An ancient Greek city-state, dazzling in its marble facades and bustling marketplaces, yet built upon the unacknowledged labor of its slaves. People who lived in shadow so that others could stand in the sun. In Athens or Corinth, the sight of slaves was nothing unusual. They were the spoils of war, merchandise traded openly in the agora, or the children of families whose fate had been sealed generations before. No one questioned the morality of it. The system was so deeply entrenched that it formed the foundation of the city's wealth. Chambers like this one existed everywhere, in the cellars of wealthy merchants, behind the kitchens of noble households, or beside the forges that produced weapons for endless wars. But in this particular chamber, the protagonist was not only imprisoned by stone walls, they were bound by memory. Each morning, that dim light carried with it a subtle ache, as though even the sun's warmth had been stripped away before it could reach the floor. The room was so still that the sound of each breath seemed loud, mingling with the slow, steady beat of a heart that no longer expected change. From the protagonist's perspective, the world was not measured in miles or maps, but in the number of steps from bed to door, in the length of rope that had once been tied around their wrists, and in the commands that would follow once the door creaked open. Here, dawn did not bring hope. It was merely a reminder that another cycle had begun, and the person inside had gone nowhere at all. The first sensation was always the cold. It clung to the skin like a second layer, seeping into the bones before the mind was fully awake. The rough wool blanket, riddled with thin patches, could not hold back the night chill that lingered long after the sun had technically risen. Eyes opened slowly, not because of reluctance to face the day, but because the darkness inside the room was almost indistinguishable from the darkness behind the eyelids. The ceiling above was low enough that a tall man could touch it without stretching. Wooden beams, warped with age, groaned quietly with each change in temperature. In the corner, a clay water jar sat on a crude wooden stand. The water inside was always cold and faintly metallic, tasting of the cistern outside where rainwater mixed with whatever debris the wind carried in. The protagonist lay still for a moment, listening. Silence here was never true silence. There was always the faint scratching of rats in the walls, the distant drip of water finding its way down stone cracks, and somewhere far away, the muted shuffle of feet on the tiles above, free feet. It had been 3 years since they were brought here at age 15. That number didn't come from counting days. Days blurred into each other too easily. It came from overhearing the household steward mention, in passing, that the boy was nearly grown now. Nearly grown, as though they were nothing but a crop to be harvested when ripe. 3 years earlier, they had been taken during a coastal raid. Ships belonging to a rival polis had struck without warning, torching homes and dragging survivors onto the decks. The young and strong were worth coin in the slave markets. The old and infirm were left behind, often to burn with their houses. It was a transaction dressed in the trappings of war. Nothing personal, only profit. And here, in the heart of this wealthy Athenian household, the reality of that profit was lived out daily. The city's official historians wrote of democracy, philosophy, and grand oratory in the agora. But in the shadows, another truth ran alongside, one rarely recorded: the vast machinery of servitude that sustained those ideals. Philosophers debated the nature of virtue while their wine was poured by hands that would never be free. The protagonist's duties were varied but unchanging in essence. Wake before the household, clean the marble floors until they reflected the morning light, fetch water from the well, prepare oil lamps for the evening, and stand ready for errands at a moment's notice. There was no room for refusal. Commands were not requests. But the worst part was not the labor, it was the erasure of identity. They were no longer called by their birth name. Here, they were pace, a word that meant boy, but in practice meant property. In ancient Greek society, the term was common for male slaves, particularly those kept for domestic service. It was a label that could belong to anyone, and in belonging to everyone, it belonged to no one. As the door finally creaked open, the light from the corridor stabbed into the gloom like a blade. A tall figure stepped in, the overseer. His sandals slapped softly against the stone floor, the sound oddly loud in the small space. In one hand, he held a small bronze oil lamp. In the other, a short wooden staff, not for walking. "You're slow to rise today, Pace," the overseer said, his tone neither cruel nor kind. It was simply the voice of someone who gave orders and expected them obeyed without thought. The protagonists swung their legs over the side of the bed, feeling the cold bite through the thin fabric of their tunic. Bare feet met the icy floor, toes curling reflexively. They stood without speaking. Conversation was unnecessary here, only action mattered. Outside the room, the household was already stirring. The kitchen fire snapped and hissed as bread was set to bake. In the courtyard, a slave girl swept fallen olive leaves into a neat pile. Somewhere, the master's children laughed as they chased each other, their footsteps light and unburdened by chains, visible or otherwise. The protagonist followed the overseer into the light, their shadow stretching long across the polished marble. For a moment, they caught their reflection in the floor. Not the clear image of a free person, but a warped shape, stretched and twisted by the stone's imperfections. It struck them how fitting that was. Their life, too, was a reflection warped by the will of others. Here, in this house, they were a ghost of the person they once were. And yet, even a ghost could remember. The overseer's staff tapped lightly against the floor as they walked, a rhythm that set the pace for the day before words did. Every morning began with the same route, through the narrow servants' passage, into the main courtyard, and then to the kitchen. This sequence had become so familiar that the protagonist could have traced it blindfolded. The courtyard was open to the sky, framed by columns of smooth white marble. In the center, a shallow fountain trickled softly, its water catching the pale gold of the early sun. This was the heart of the house, where family members took their meals in warm weather, where guests were received, and where the master could display his wealth in the form of imported plants, rare stones, and intricate mosaics. For the protagonist, the beauty of the space was irrelevant. They saw not the artistry of the mosaics, but the dirt between the tiles that they would later be ordered to scrub clean. They noted the angle of the sunlight, calculating how much time they had before it became too bright to finish certain chores without sweating through their tunic, something the mistress frowned upon. The first task today was to prepare the master's morning wash. This meant fetching fresh water from the household cistern and carrying it in a large clay crater to the bathing room. The crater was almost half the protagonist's height, its rough surface biting into their palms as they lifted. The water was heavy, over 20 liters, and the weight pressed down on the shoulders with a familiar ache. In Athens, morning bathing was a privilege of the wealthy. Ordinary citizens might rinse their hands and faces, but full immersion, scented oils, and clean linen were luxuries reserved for those with silver to spare. The master's wash involved warm water, aromatic herbs steeped until fragrant, and the careful laying out of linen towels that had been beaten soft by repeated washing. As the protagonist poured water into the bronze basin, Steam rose faintly in the cool morning air. The scent of thyme and marjoram drifted upward, herbs gathered by other slaves from the hills outside the city. The master would step into this room without a thought for how each element had been prepared, just as one might enjoy a ripe fig without considering the months of pruning, watering, and labor that made it possible. The overseer watched closely as the work was done. His eyes missed nothing: the exact temperature of the water, the alignment of the towels, the neatness of the sponge and strigil set on the side table. Any mistake, however small, would mean a reprimand or worse. When the task was complete, the protagonist stepped back and stood with hands clasped in front, eyes lowered. Not from humility, from habit. In this world, looking directly at the master or mistress without permission was considered impertinence. A wrong look could be taken as insolence, and insolence was not tolerated. In the quiet moments before the master arrived, the protagonist allowed themselves a fleeting thought. Once, they too had been woken by sunlight, had washed their face in cold stream water, had eaten bread still warm from their mother's hearth. The memory was sharp enough to cut, but it was also fading. Each year in bondage was a year stolen from that life, erasing it grain by grain. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the thought. Sandals slapped against marble. A deeper, confident rhythm than the overseer's. The master entered, robed in fine linen, his hair bound with a leather tie. Without a glance toward the protagonist, he extended his arms for assistance. It was the protagonist's task to pour the warm water over his hands, then his feet, catching it in a basin so it would not splash onto the floor. This was done slowly, almost ceremonially, and ended with the offering of a towel. The master dried himself without thanks, not out of cruelty, but because thanks were not part of the transaction between owner and owned. When the ritual was complete, the master dismissed them with a wave. There was no pause, no acknowledgement. The protagonist stepped backward, bowed slightly, and left the room. The overseer followed, closing the door with a solid thud, a sound that always felt like a lock turning. Outside, the courtyard was fully awake. Other servants were carrying trays of figs, bread, and cheese to the family's breakfast table. A boy not much younger than the protagonist was polishing the bronze mirror in the colonnade. Somewhere in the distance, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer marked the beginning of another day in the city. The overseer handed down the next order: sweep the courtyard, then polish the marble floor before the guests arrived at midday. And so the cycle continued. By the time the sun rose higher, the courtyard had shifted from the soft stillness of morning to the bustling center of the household. The marble columns threw sharp shadows onto the floor, and every sound, footsteps, the scrape of a broom, the clink of pottery, seemed amplified in the heat. The protagonist swept methodically, each stroke of the broom pushing fine dust toward the edges. Dust was the enemy here. It dulled the shine of the marble and settled into the tiny crevices of the mosaics, erasing their intricate patterns. It was a strange irony. The wealthy loved open courtyards that welcomed air and light, yet cursed the dust those same breezes carried. Once the sweeping was done, the marble had to be polished. The method was simple but exhausting. A mixture of crushed pumice and vinegar was spread across the floor, then scrubbed in small circles with a cloth. This not only cleaned but gave the marble a faint gleam, the kind of detail guests noticed, even if they never said so aloud. In Athens, the midday meal was as much about display as nourishment. Wealthy households treated lunch not merely as eating, but as an opportunity to show refinement. The arrangement of food, the coolness of the drinking water, even the scent of the air in the courtyard, all were part of the performance. The protagonist's role in this was invisible to the guests. They would never know who fetched the cool water from the cistern before the sun could warm it, who rinsed the figs to remove the dust, who checked each loaf of bread for imperfections before placing it in the basket. This was the labor that supported the illusion of effortless hospitality. By late morning, the kitchen was a controlled chaos. Slaves moved like parts of a single machine, some tending the fire, others slicing fruit, others carrying dishes to the serving area. The overseer patrolled like a hawk, his gaze snapping from one worker to the next. No one dared slow down, not even for a moment. The protagonist was sent to the storeroom, a cool, dim space lined with amphorae of oil and wine, baskets of dried fish, jars of honey, and sacks of grain. They carried back a jar of imported olive oil, heavy and sealed with wax. This oil would be drizzled lightly over roasted vegetables for the master's guests. A simple gesture that spoke of wealth, because only the rich could afford oil not pressed locally. The household also kept a small herb garden within the inner courtyard, carefully tended for both cooking and medicinal use. The protagonist passed it on their way back from the storeroom, noting the sharp scent of basil and the faint sweetness of oregano in the air. These herbs were cut fresh each day, because freshness was another mark of refinement. By midday, the heat was pressing in from all sides. The marble reflected it upward, the tiled roofs radiated it downward, and the air itself seemed to shimmer. In such heat, the protagonist's linen tunic clung damply to their skin. But there was no pause, no moment to rest in the shade. The guests were arriving soon, and the household had to present itself as if the work had been effortless. From the upper level, laughter drifted down, the master's voice among others, perhaps greeting early arrivals. That sound was the signal. The dining area had to be perfect now. The protagonist and two others moved quickly, setting cushions in place, arranging low tables, placing bowls of olives and figs where they could be reached easily. Each cushion's angle was adjusted, each tablecloth smoothed, each dish aligned with the next. The guests would see none of the frantic adjustments, none of the sweat beading at the edges of the servants' hairlines. They would see only cool marble, neatly arranged tables, and the illusion that this household existed in a state of perpetual elegance. In this way, the protagonist had learned that service in a wealthy home was as much about invisibility as it was about labor. If the work was noticed, it meant something had gone wrong. True success was to be unseen, to make comfort and beauty appear as if it had always been there, waiting. The overseer gave a final inspection, running his hand along the edge of a tablecloth, checking the water jug for condensation. He gave a short nod. The preparations were complete. The protagonist stepped back into the shadowed passageway, ready to be summoned at any moment, but hidden from view until needed. This was the rhythm of the day. Moments of intense, visible work followed by stretches of waiting in the margins, ready to reappear only when called. Beyond the walls, Athens itself was alive with its own midday activity. Merchants shouting prices in the agora, children playing in the shade of porticos, priests tending temple fires. The protagonist could hear faint traces of that life beyond, a reminder of a world they could not step into freely. And so, as the guests began to arrive, the protagonist remained unseen, their presence woven into the background of the gathering like the faint scent of time in the air, noticeable only if it were suddenly gone. The dining room, the andron, was the pride of the house. It was reserved for male guests, a space of political conversation, philosophical debate, and the subtle games of influence that kept Athenian society in motion. The room was arranged in a U-shape of low couches, each wide enough for a man to recline upon, propped on one elbow while eating. Between the couches stood small tables, their polished wood gleaming under the filtered light that spilled in from a high window. The floor was a mosaic of dolphins and waves, a reminder that Athens' power rested upon the sea. When the protagonist entered, carrying a tray of wine cups, the conversations dipped but did not stop. Servants were like furniture here, necessary, functional, and unworthy of acknowledgement unless something went wrong. The first task was the crater, the large mixing bowl in which wine was diluted with water. Athenians considered drinking unmixed wine to be barbaric, a mark of those who lacked discipline. The overseer measured the ratio carefully, murmuring the numbers under his breath, before nodding for the protagonist to begin ladling the wine into each guest's cup. The men spoke of the assembly's latest vote, of rumors from the war front, of a new play being staged in the theater district. Their words were smooth, their laughter deliberate, each exchange an opportunity to display wit or learning. Here, every conversation was part of the social theater. Alliances hinted at, rivalries sharpened, reputations burnished. As the wine flowed, so did the stories. One guest, a merchant with a voice like gravel, told of a storm off the coast of Euboea, his hands carving the air to show the size of the waves. Another, a young man with oil still in his hair from the gymnasium, recited a fragment of poetry he claimed to have composed himself, though the smirk of an older man suggested otherwise. The protagonist moved among them silently, refilling cups, replacing empty dishes with platters of roasted fish, olives, and honey cakes. The smell of the food mingled with the sharp tang of wine and the faint smoke of incense burning in a corner. At one point, a guest clicked his fingers sharply, the signal for a servant. The protagonist stepped forward at once, bowing slightly. The man wanted more figs, sliced thinly. No words of thanks were given. None were expected. While the men reclined in comfort, the servants navigated the narrow spaces between couches, bending and reaching without ever disrupting the flow of conversation. It was a kind of dance, learned over years, requiring precise timing and perfect awareness of one's surroundings. Beyond the andron, the women of the household, if they were present at all, remained in the gyneconitis, the women's quarters. They would not mingle with the male guests. Such was the custom. The only women who entered the dining room were entertainers, musicians, dancers, or the occasional hetaira, whose education allowed her to converse as an equal with men. Halfway through the meal, a lyre player was brought in. His fingers danced across the strings, weaving a melody that softened the edges of conversation. The rhythm of the gathering shifted. Laughter grew warmer, voices lowered, and a faint haze of wine-induced ease settled over the room. For the protagonist, this was the most dangerous part of the banquet. As wine loosened tongues, tempers could flare over perceived slights, or demands could grow unreasonable. A servant might be ordered to fetch something impossible, and failure could mean a beating. Tonight, however, the gathering remained peaceful. The guests were too absorbed in their talk and in the delicate slices of honey-drizzled cheese to notice much else. From his place in the shadows, the protagonist studied them, the fine folds of their tunics, the glint of their rings, the way they gestured with hands accustomed to command. This was the Athens most would never see. Not the public speeches in the agora, but the private networks of influence built over wine and whispered promises. The overseer caught the protagonist's eye and gave the smallest of nods, a signal to begin clearing the earlier courses in preparation for the final round of food. The protagonist moved in silently, lifting platters without disturbing the arrangement of cups or spilling a drop of wine. As the last dishes were brought out, the conversation turned to the Olympic Games, still a few months away. Wagers were made, athletes praised or mocked, and the city's pride in its champions filled the room. By the time the banquet began to wind down, the sky outside had deepened into indigo. The guests lingered, reluctant to leave the comfort of the couches and the warm glow of camaraderie. When they finally rose, servants rushed forward with basins of water for washing hands, scented lightly with crushed rosemary. The protagonist remained until the very last man had stepped into the courtyard, sandals slapping softly against the stone. Then the andron was theirs again, though only for the labor of cleaning. The social theater was over. The real work was about to begin. When the last echo of sandals faded from the courtyard, the house seemed to exhale. The lively hum of voices, the clink of cups, the rising and falling music, all of it left behind a silence heavy with exhaustion. The andron, once a place of display and prestige, now looked more like a battlefield. Platters were smeared with oil and honey, crumbs clung to the edges of the mosaic dolphins, and the air was thick with the mingled scents of wine, roasted meat, and sweat. The protagonist knew there was no time to linger. The overseer gave his orders with a curt gesture. Clear the tables, sweep the floor, scrub the stains before they settled into the porous stone. The other servants moved with practiced efficiency, each knowing their role. One collected cups, stacking them carefully to avoid chipping the delicate pottery. Another gathered the half-eaten loaves, scraping them into a basket for the kitchen slaves who would sort what could be fed to animals. The protagonist worked at the mosaics, kneeling with a rag soaked in vinegar water, coaxing dark wine stains from between the tiny tesserae. The cold seeped into his knees, and the scent of vinegar made his eyes water. Yet he worked in silence. Any complaint would be met with a sharper task or a cutting remark from the overseer. In the kitchen, the hearth fire was dying to embers. Pots still steamed faintly, their contents reduced to scraps. The scullery slaves scraped pans, the sound a harsh rhythm in the otherwise muted space. A jug of leftover watered wine sat on a shelf, forbidden for servants unless offered by the master, but the protagonist felt its presence like a pull at the back of his throat. He ignored it. Once the andron was cleared, they moved on to the floors of the main hall. Sand and dust from the guests' sandals had been ground into the surface. The protagonist swept in long, deliberate strokes, the bristles whispering against stone. In the dim lamplight, each speck of grit seemed to glint like a reminder of the work still ahead. It was during this quiet labor that the mind wandered most. Snatches of overheard conversation returned, mentions of war, trade routes, political alliances. The men in the andron spoke of decisions that could change the fate of thousands. Yet they had never looked into the eyes of those who scrubbed their floors. Hours passed this way, the night deepening until the stars wheeled high above the open courtyard. The other servants began to peel away, assigned to different corners of the household. The protagonist remained, setting out fresh oil for the lamps, replacing worn wicks, polishing bronze fittings so that the master would awaken to a house in perfect order. It was a strange kind of invisibility. Guests saw only the sheen of hospitality, the gleaming cups, the scented water, the smooth service, never the sleepless hands that made it possible. By the time the overseer gave the nod to retire, the protagonist's body ached from the strain of bending, lifting, and scrubbing. The fingers were raw from vinegar water, the shoulders tight from carrying heavy trays. Yet there was no bed in the luxurious rooms of the household for a servant. Instead, he descended once more into the dim chamber beneath the house, the servants' quarters. The air was cooler here, but it carried the damp smell of stone. Mats were laid along the wall, thin and worn. He lay down slowly, feeling the weight of the day press into his bones. The sounds of the city had stilled. Even the dogs in the street had ceased barking. Only the faint drip of water from somewhere in the darkness marked the passage of time. It was in this hour, before sleep claimed him, that the protagonist allowed himself the smallest act of rebellion, the preservation of memory. He pictured the moonlight falling on the dolphins of the andron's mosaic, the curve of a guest's smile when his cup was filled just so, the fragments of poetry drifting through the air. To remember was to hold on to something the household could not take from him. Tomorrow there would be more work. Another gathering, another set of trays to carry, floors to sweep, stains to scrub. But for now he turned toward the wall, closed his eyes, and let the darkness take him. The banquet was over. The house slept, and so finally could he. Sleep did not come easily. Even when the body was drained, the mind still turned over old memories like stones in a riverbed. He had been told, as if it were a kindness, that he was fortunate to be taken into a wealthy household, that he was spared the mines, the galleys, or the open market. But fortune had a bitter taste when it came wrapped in iron. The protagonist was not born in Athens. His memories of home were patchy now, dulled by years of servitude, but flashes still rose unbidden. The sound of goats' bells on a hillside, the warm scent of fresh bread from his mother's hearth, a dirt path winding between olive groves, leading to a small cluster of houses where neighbors called to one another by name. That life ended in a single afternoon. The raiders came without warning, men in mismatched armor, speaking a dialect he half understood. They moved with ruthless efficiency, herding villagers into the square, binding wrists with coarse rope. The old and infirm were struck down where they stood. The young and strong were shoved into a line for transport. He remembered the sun that day, how bright it was, how wrong it seemed that such violence could unfold beneath a sky so blue. They were marched for days toward the coast, each step pulling him farther from everything he knew. Some tried to resist. One boy, no older than 12, broke from the line and ran into the scrubland. He was brought down within moments, beaten until he could no longer stand. The rest of them learned to keep their heads down and their pace steady. At the port, the air reeked of salt and tar. Ships with painted eyes on their prows waited to carry their human cargo across the wine-dark sea. He was loaded onto one with dozens of others, chained at the ankle. The voyage was long enough for blisters to form and break on his feet, long enough for the taste of fear to become as constant as the rocking of the deck. When they arrived in Athens, the market square was already humming. Stalls offered olives, figs, amphorae of oil, and human beings. Buyers inspected the captives as they might inspect cattle, checking teeth, feeling muscle, questioning age and skills. The protagonist's turn came. A man in a fine chiton looked him over, asked a question the boy didn't understand. The slave trader answered for him, exaggerating his abilities. A price was agreed upon, and with a slap of hands the boy's fate was sealed. From that moment he belonged to the household. At first, everything was bewildering. The sheer size of the house, the constant activity, the rules spoken and unspoken. He learned quickly. Never look a guest in the eye unless addressed. Never eat from the master's food unless given permission. Never speak of his past unless asked. The overseer was his first true teacher in slavery. Not in kindness but in survival. There were ways to work efficiently, ways to avoid punishment, ways to stay invisible when tempers flared. The overseer made it clear. If you are noticed, it should be for how well you serve, nothing else. Over time, the protagonist stopped measuring days by sunrises and sunsets. Instead, he measured them by tasks. Sweeping the courtyard, polishing bronze, tending to lamps, carrying water. Life became a cycle of repetition, predictable in its demands, unyielding in its pace. Yet the past never fully loosened its grip. Sometimes, in the quiet between duties, he would think of the hills beyond his old home. He would wonder if anyone had survived, if the olive groves still stood, if the hearth in his mother's house still burned. Those thoughts were dangerous. They could spark longing, and longing could lead to mistakes. In this life, mistakes were costly, so he learned to bury them deep. Still, on nights when the moon was bright and the courtyard empty, he sometimes let his gaze drift upward. He imagined that the same moon shone on his old village, on the paths and faces he had lost. It was the one thread that connected him to that other life, a silent witness, indifferent yet constant. And so, though the household owned his body, there remained a part of him they could not touch. Not yet. The first year in the household was the hardest. Every task was a test. Every gesture was judged. The master's wife had a way of raising one eyebrow that could reduce even the most seasoned servant to stammering apologies. The elder slaves, long since broken to the rhythms of the house, moved like clockwork. Their precision only made the newcomer's mistakes more obvious. In those early days, his world shrank to the boundaries of the estate. Beyond its walls lay the streets of Athens, bustling with merchants, philosophers, soldiers, and thieves. But those sights were reserved for trusted servants. He had yet to earn that privilege. The overseer kept him close, assigning him to menial but essential tasks. Cleaning the mosaics in the courtyard, oiling the hinges of the great bronze doors, emptying the chamber pots before dawn. These were not tasks of dignity, but they were tasks of trust, and trust, in the overseer's mind, had to be tested in the smallest things before it could be risked in larger ones. Punishment was never far away. A dropped amphora, a missed spot on a polished vessel, a delay in delivering water. All were grounds for correction. Sometimes it was a sharp word, other times the cane. Yet there were lessons hidden in the cruelty. The boy learned to move silently, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to read the shifting expressions of those above him. He learned when to make himself useful, and when to disappear into the background like a shadow. He also learned the hierarchy within the slave quarters. Not all slaves were equal. There were household slaves, like him, whose duties kept them indoors, close to the family. There were outdoor slaves, gardeners, stable boys, and porters, who faced the elements but enjoyed more freedom of movement. And then there were the specialists, the cook, the scribe, the steward. These held a strange sort of power, for their skills were rare, and the household depended on them. Friendships formed quietly. A nod here, a smuggled piece of bread there. Late at night, when the overseer slept, whispered conversations wound through the cramped quarters. Stories of other cities, rumors of freedom, fragments of songs from distant homelands. It was in those hushed hours that the boy began to stitch together a mental map of the house, its routines, and its vulnerabilities. Not because he intended to escape. The streets of Athens were no safe haven for an unaccompanied slave, but because knowledge was its own kind of power. He discovered that the master rose late, that the mistress preferred her wine warmed in winter, that the youngest daughter liked to feed bits of bread to the pigeons on the roof. These details seemed trivial, but in a household, the trivial often became the decisive. Over time, the overseer began sending him on short errands beyond the gates. To fetch a particular spice from the market, to deliver a sealed message to a family friend, to carry a bolt of dyed wool to the weaver's shop. The first time he walked through the city streets, he felt both exposed and invisible. Athens was louder than he had imagined. A constant chorus of voices calling prices, debating philosophy, arguing politics. The smell of roasting meat mixed with the stench of tanneries. The air itself seemed to vibrate with energy. But even as he took in the sights, he kept his head bowed. Slaves in the city were as common as paving stones. No one looked twice at him. When he returned, the overseer said nothing, merely handed him another task. But the boy knew it was a kind of silent approval. By the end of that first year, something in him had shifted. The sting of his capture still lived in his bones, but it had been dulled by repetition. He had learned the patterns of the household, and in learning them had found small ways to navigate and occasionally bend its rules. He was no longer entirely the boy who had stood in the village square under a sky too blue for tragedy. That boy still lived within him, but he had been forced to grow a harder shell. He didn't yet know that this shell would be tested and cracked, in ways he could not yet imagine. It began subtly. The master, a man in his early 50s with a thick beard streaked with silver, had always been a distant presence, glimpsed in the periphery as he strode through the colonnaded halls, his toga sweeping the marble floors. But one day, the boy noticed the master's gaze lingering just a moment longer than usual. At first, he thought little of it. The master watched everyone. That was the nature of authority. But over the weeks, the glances became more frequent, more deliberate. Sometimes, the master would pause in conversation with a guest, his eyes briefly flicking toward the boy before returning to the matter at hand. The overseer noticed too. His instructions changed. The boy was now tasked with serving wine at the symposiums, those long, indulgent evenings when the master entertained friends with food, music, and philosophical debate. It was a privilege of sorts, but also a performance. Every movement was scrutinized. Spill a drop of wine on a guest's himation and the humiliation would be remembered for weeks. In the glow of the oil lamps, the boy would stand at the edge of the gathering, ready to refill cups. The air was thick with the smell of roasted lamb, honeyed pastries, and the sharp tang of unmixed wine. Laughter rolled through the room, punctuated by bursts of argument, as men quoted lines from Homer or debated the virtues of Sparta versus Athens. The master, seated at the center of the couch arrangement, would occasionally beckon the boy closer, not for wine, but for small, seemingly idle questions. How long have you been in this house? Do you know the road to Piraeus? Where were you born? The questions were casual, but the boy could sense there was more behind them. The master was measuring him, weighing something unseen. It wasn't long before he was given tasks beyond his usual duties. Fetching rare scrolls from the study, delivering messages sealed with the family crest, accompanying the master to the market, walking a pace behind like a silent shadow. The household whispered. Some said the master favored him because he was quick-witted. Others suggested more dangerous reasons. Reasons best left unspoken in the cramped slave quarters. The boy himself was torn. The attention meant trust, and trust could be a kind of leverage. But it also meant visibility, and in a house like this, visibility was as dangerous as it was rewarding. One evening, during a smaller gathering, the master called for music. The lyre player had not yet arrived, so the master turned to the boy. "You," he said, "can you sing?" The boy hesitated. "Yes, master." "Then sing." And so he did. A song from his homeland, one his mother used to hum while grinding grain in the early dawn. The melody was simple, the words in a dialect no one in the room understood. But when he finished, the master's expression was unreadable. From that night on, the boy was summoned more often, not just for service, but for companionship in those quiet hours when the master sat alone in his study, poring over ledgers or contemplating some private matter. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't. The boy knew he was being drawn into the master's inner circle, and that such proximity could either raise a slave above the rest, or ruin him entirely. And deep down, in the part of himself he kept locked away, he wondered if this newfound attention was a gift, or the first link in a chain he could not yet see. Came without warning. The boy was summoned to the master's private quarters at dusk. The last light of the day spilled through the tall windows, staining the marble floors in bands of gold and shadow. The master sat at a low table, an unopened scroll before him, and a single clay lamp flickering at his elbow. "Close the door," he said. The boy obeyed. The master gestured to the seat across from him, a rare invitation. When the boy sat, the master unrolled the scroll. It was a list of names, written in neat, deliberate script. Beside each name was a short note, a debt owed, a favor granted, an insult never forgotten. "You can read?" the master asked. The boy nodded. It was dangerous to admit, but the master already knew. "Good. Then you understand what this is." The boy's eyes scanned the list. Merchants, local officials, even one or two members of the city council. "These men," the master continued, "owe me something. Some owe coin, some owe silence. All owe respect. You will go to them one by one and deliver my messages. The wording is important." He handed the boy a second scroll sealed with wax. "Say only what I have written. Nothing more. Nothing less." It sounded simple enough, but the boy's stomach tightened. Delivering such messages meant being the master's voice. And in Athens, words could be weapons sharper than any blade. The first visit was to a wine merchant whose stall was nestled in the crowded agora. The boy waited until the merchant's customers had left, then presented the scroll. The man read it in silence, his jaw tightening. When he looked up, there was something cold in his eyes. "Tell your master," he said slowly, "that I understand." The boy nodded, turned, and walked away, but the merchant's stare burned into his back long after he had gone. The second name was worse. A city official whose influence extended into the courts. When the boy delivered the message, the man's smile never reached his eyes. "You are a brave little messenger," he murmured, placing a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "Bravery can be dangerous." By the time he returned to the villa, the boy's pulse was still pounding. The master was waiting in the atrium. "Well, I delivered them exactly as you wrote," the boy said. The master's lips curved into a thin smile. "Good. You are learning." The boy wanted to ask what the messages meant, but he didn't. Curiosity could be a noose. Still, he couldn't help wondering. Had he just been used to threaten powerful men? That night, the overseer found him in the slave quarters. "You've been noticed," the man said quietly. "That can be the making of you, or it can be the end. Tread carefully." The boy understood. He had passed the first test of loyalty, but in doing so, he had stepped deeper into a game he didn't yet understand. And in this house, every game had a cost. The boy had learned the rhythm of the villa at night, when the kitchen fires were banked low, when the guards on the outer wall grew lax, when the master's favored guests lingered over their wine in the inner courtyard. It was during one of these quiet intervals that he found himself carrying a jug of watered wine through the east hall. The lamplight there was dim, the mosaic floor glimmering faintly in the shadows. He was nearly past the library when he heard it, voices low but sharp, leaking through the half-open door. He recognized the first voice instantly, the master's, calm, deliberate, every word measured. The second voice was unfamiliar, deeper, with a clipped Athenian accent. "You cannot press him any further," the stranger said. "The council is already restless. If you push, they'll turn on you." "I push only as far as I need to," the master replied. "And when the time comes, they'll be too divided to act." The boy froze. He knew he should move on, but something rooted him to the spot. "You've set your messengers on dangerous paths," the stranger warned. "That child you're using, what happens when someone decides to make an example of him?" The master's answer came without hesitation. "Then he serves his purpose in another way." A silence followed. The boy's chest tightened. "You're playing a dangerous game," the stranger said at last. "It's the only game worth playing," the master replied. The sound of a chair scraping across the marble jolted the boy into motion. He slipped into the shadowed corner by the staircase just as the library door opened. The stranger emerged first. A tall man with a trimmed beard and eyes that swept the hall like a hawk scanning for prey. Behind him came the master, his expression unreadable. They walked past without noticing him. The boy remained pressed to the wall until the sound of their sandals faded. Only then did he breathe again. Back in the slave quarters, he lay awake for hours. The master had spoken of him, as if he were a tool, not a person, something to be spent and discarded. He had always known this was the truth, but hearing it confirmed in the master's own voice made it heavier, sharper. Somewhere deep inside, a seed of something new began to take root. It was not rebellion, not yet, but it was the first whisper of doubt, and doubt could grow. The boy did not fully understand what the counsel was, but he had heard the word often enough in hushed conversations. It was not the master's household counsel, that much was certain. No, this was something larger, something beyond the walls of the villa, where men with polished sandals and voices like iron decided matters that could topple families. Over the next week, fragments of conversation drifted to him like scraps carried by the wind. In the stables, two older slaves whispered while oiling the harness straps. "They're saying the council's split in two," one murmured, "and the master sits right between them, selling his favor to the highest bidder," the other replied. In the kitchens, the cook muttered to her assistant as she ground herbs. "If he bets wrong, they'll strip him of everything." "He won't bet wrong," the assistant said quickly, but his eyes darted toward the door as though afraid someone might be listening. The boy listened more than he spoke. He learned that the master had enemies, men who had been waiting for the smallest excuse to cut him down. He also learned that the master had allies, but allies in Athens were like summer clouds, bright for a moment, gone the next. One evening, the master ordered the boy to carry a sealed message to a guest lodging in the Western guest house. The guest, a man with sharp features and a heavy gold ring, broke the seal and read in silence. Then he looked at the boy. "You," he said, "do you know what this says?" The boy shook his head. "Good," the man replied. "It means you will live longer." He handed the boy a small coin, not as payment, but as if to mark the end of the conversation. By now, the boy understood that whatever game the master was playing, it reached far beyond the villa gates. The council was not some distant, abstract power. It was a storm building over their heads, one that could sweep everyone away when it broke. That night, in the cramped quarters he shared with 3 other servants, the boy lay awake staring at the wooden rafters above. He tried to imagine life after the storm. Would he still be here, pouring wine for new masters? Or would he be sold again, perhaps to someone harsher? In the darkness, he remembered the stranger's warning in the library. "That child you're using, what happens when someone decides to make an example of him?" He wasn't sure which frightened him more, the master's enemies or the master himself. The morning was pale and cold when the master summoned the boy to the inner courtyard. 2 guards stood nearby, their spears grounded, their expressions unreadable. In the master's hand was a small wax-sealed packet no larger than a fig. "You will take this to the agora," the master said. "You will give it only to the man who asks for the merchant from Rhodes. You will speak to no one else." The boy nodded, though his pulse quickened. The master's gaze lingered on him. "If you fail, do not return." It was not a threat spoken loudly, but the kind that carried its weight in the quiet. A servant handed the boy a hooded cloak, rough-woven and smelling faintly of smoke. It would help him blend with the market crowd. As he stepped beyond the villa gates, the winter air struck his cheeks. The guards at the road barely looked at him, just another errand boy among dozens. The city was already alive when he reached it. Merchants shouted prices in a dozen dialects. The air thick with the scent of roasting meat, fish brine, and crushed olives. The agora stretched wide before him, ringed with columns, alive with barter and politics. He kept his eyes moving. Twice he thought he spotted someone watching him. A man in a gray chiton leaning against a pillar, a woman with a basket of figs who seemed to glance at him too often, but the crowd made it hard to be sure. Finally, near a stall selling dyed wool, he heard the words, "Looking for the merchant from Rhodes?" The voice belonged to a man in his 30s, clean-shaven, wearing a dark himation pulled high around his shoulders. His eyes, however, did not smile. The boy handed over the packet. The man slipped it inside his garment without looking at it. "Walk west toward the olive press," he said quietly. "Do not turn back." The boy obeyed, but as he neared the edge of the agora, shouts erupted behind him. A crash, the sound of a stall being overturned, and then the tramp of running feet. He didn't wait to see who it was. He broke into a run, ducking through an alley so narrow he had to twist his shoulders to pass. The air here was damp and smelled of mildew. Somewhere behind him, footsteps pounded on the stones. He burst out into a sunlit side street, nearly colliding with an old woman carrying a jar of oil. She cursed at him, but he didn't stop. He ran until his lungs burned, until the noise of pursuit faded into the general roar of the city. Only then did he slow, blending back into the market crowd, his cloak pulled tight. He didn't know who had been chasing him, or whether they had been after the man from Rhodes, the packet, or himself. But he knew this. The master's errand had nearly cost him his life, and the day was not yet over. By the time the boy returned to the villa, the sun was already sliding toward the western hills, staining the courtyard marble with streaks of gold. His legs ached from running. His cloak was damp with sweat, and his mind replayed the shouts in the agora again and again. The gate guards eyed him with faint curiosity but did not speak as they let him in. He had half expected them to bar his way, or worse, to drag him straight to the cellar. In the atrium, the master was seated on a low couch, one elbow resting lazily on the armrest, a cup of wine in his hand. He was listening to a report from one of his men, who stood stiff as a spear. The moment the boy entered, both pairs of eyes fixed on him. "You're late," the master said. His voice was not loud, but it cut like a blade. "There was trouble in the agora," the boy replied, keeping his gaze lowered. "Someone overturned stalls. I avoided them." The master's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Avoided or ran?" The boy said nothing. The man standing beside the master gave a short laugh. "He ran, no doubt." The master lifted his cup, took a slow sip, and then set it down. "And yet," he said, "you're standing here with all your limbs intact. That's more than I expected." From a small table beside him, the master picked up a coin, silver, its surface worn but still bearing the profile of an old king. He flicked it toward the boy. It landed at his feet with a sharp clink. "Take it," the master said. "A reward. And a reminder. If you can survive the agora, you can survive what comes next." The boy crouched, picked up the coin, and felt its cold weight in his palm. It was the first time the master had given him anything outright. But the gift did not feel clean. "Rest tonight," the master added, already turning back to his other man. "Tomorrow you will go farther." The boy bowed and left the atrium, the coin hidden in his fist. As he walked back toward the slave quarters, he could feel the stares of other servants, some curious, some envious, some dark with suspicion. In his small sleeping space, he lay staring at the ceiling long after the lamps had been extinguished. The silver coin sat in the dust beside him, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. It was proof he had done well, and a warning that the master's trust was a chain as much as any shackle. The boy didn't know yet whether he would keep the coin, or use it for something the master would never forgive. The next morning, the air was sharp with the scent of early rain. The boy was summoned before sunrise to the master's private study, where the lamps still burned low. The master was seated at a desk, rolling a strip of parchment between his fingers. "This," the master said, sliding the parchment into a narrow wooden tube. Goes to a man at the port. You will hand it to him directly. No one else. The boy nodded. He will ask you for a word. You will answer with Erythrian dawn. Remember it. The boy repeated the phrase. The master's eyes narrowed. If you forget, he will assume you are a spy, and you will die quickly. Understand? The boy understood. He took the tube, tucked it inside his cloak, and set out. The road to the port wound down from the villa into the waking city. Market stalls were being assembled. The smell of fish and damp wood filling the air. Gulls screamed overhead, diving toward scraps left from yesterday's trade. At the far end of the docks, near a cluster of cargo sheds, the boy spotted a man leaning against a post, tall, wiry, with a hood drawn low. His eyes scanned the crowd with the patience of a predator. The boy approached cautiously, feeling the small weight of the message against his ribs. But before he could speak, a shadow fell across them both. A second man, broader, with a scar across his jaw, stepped in from the side. "That's close enough," he said, his voice carrying the edge of command. The hooded man stiffened. "Do you have something for me, boy?" The boy glanced between them, his mind scrambling for the phrase. Erythrian dawn. He opened his mouth to speak, but the scarred man's hand shot out, gripping his wrist. "I'll take that," he said, prying the wooden tube free with practiced ease. The boy tried to protest, but the scarred man's gaze pinned him silent. Without another word, the man turned and disappeared into the tangle of dockside alleys, leaving only the faint smell of tar and sweat in his wake. The hooded man swore under his breath. "You've just lost us both more than you know." He pushed away from the post and vanished into the crowd. The boy stood frozen, the empty space inside his cloak feeling heavier than the message had. When he finally moved, his steps were slow, leaden. He knew that by the time he returned to the villa, the master would already know the delivery had failed. And in the master's world, failure was not something you walked away from easily. The boy's return to the villa felt like walking into a storm. He could not see but could hear building in the distance. Every step up the gravel path made the weight in his stomach grow heavier. The steward met him at the entrance. His face was unreadable, but his grip on the boy's arm was like iron. "Come," he said. "He's waiting." The study door was already open. Inside, the master stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the gardens as though they could offer him a different answer than the one he already knew. "Close the door," the master said, his voice low. The boy obeyed. "Where is it?" The boy swallowed. "It was taken, master." "A man." "I know it was taken," the master interrupted, turning sharply. His eyes were no longer calm. They burned like coals in the half-light. "What I want to know is whether you were careless or treacherous." The boy shook his head quickly. "I remembered the phrase, master, but another man appeared first." "He." The master's hand came down hard on the desk, the crack of wood echoing in the room. "You think I care for details of how? I trusted you with something that could decide the fate of this household, and you lost it." Silence hung between them for a moment, broken only by the muffled sound of rain beginning to patter against the shutters. The master stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Do you understand what that message contained?" The boy shook his head. "It was not merely words, boy. It was proof that could ruin a man on the council. And now it is in the hands of someone who will gladly see me destroyed." The boy's heart pounded. "What will you do, master?" "What will we do?" the master corrected. "Is recover it, and you will be the bait." The boy's breath caught. "Bait?" The master smiled thinly. "They think you are just a servant who blundered into their game. We will let them think that. You will go back to the port tomorrow, as though nothing happened. And when they come for you, my men will be waiting." The boy wanted to protest, to say that this was not his fight, but the words never left his mouth. In the master's eyes, he was not a person with choices, he was a tool. And tools did not decide how they were used. As the master dismissed him, the boy understood that tomorrow could end with the message recovered, or with his body floating somewhere beneath the dark waters of the harbor. The harbor smelled of salt, fish, and the faint rot of yesterday's catch baking in the morning sun. The boy walked slowly along the stone quay, head down, playing the part of a servant on a meaningless errand. Beneath his tunic, his hands were slick with sweat. The master's men were out there somewhere, hidden among the crowd. A fisherman mending a net, a dockworker shifting crates, a merchant arguing over the price of olive oil. To the casual eye, they were nothing more than background noise in the bustle of the port. But the boy knew their eyes were fixed on him. He carried a small satchel slung over his shoulder, its weight deliberately deceptive. Inside was nothing but folded cloth, a decoy meant to draw out the man who had taken the message. A gull shrieked overhead as he passed the same alley where the theft had happened. His pulse jumped, but nothing stirred in the shadows. Minutes stretched like hours. He wandered from stall to stall, pretending to study wares he could never afford. He could feel the act wearing thin. He had been told to linger without lingering. But every heartbeat felt like an invitation for trouble. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught the flicker of movement. A man breaking from the crowd, heading toward him with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. The boy's first instinct was to run, but he forced himself to freeze, just as the master had instructed. The man approached, smiling as if greeting an old friend. "Lost again, boy?" he asked. Before the boy could answer, the man's hand shot out, gripping the strap of the satchel. It happened fast. Two of the master's men moved in from behind, another from the side. But the stranger was quick, quicker than they had expected. He spun, slamming one man into a stack of crates, then ducked under another's grasp. A blade flashed in the sun. The boy stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding the arc of the knife. His shout was swallowed by the chaos as shouts erupted up and down the quay. Fishermen dropped their nets. Merchants grabbed their coin boxes and ran. One of the master's men tackled the stranger, but the knife found its mark, sinking into the man's shoulder. Blood darkened the fabric instantly. In that split second, the boy realized the plan was failing. The harbor was too crowded, too full of blind corners and escape routes. And the stranger knew them all. The man tore free, sprinting toward the end of the quay. The master's men gave chase, but the boy could already see how it would end. The thief would vanish into the maze of streets beyond the docks, the message still lost. And then, unexpectedly, the stranger stopped, not from exhaustion, but because a fourth figure had appeared in his path, tall, cloaked, and unmoving. The boy couldn't see the figure's face, but the stillness in his stance radiated something dangerous. The stranger hesitated, then lunged, knife ready. It was over in a heartbeat. The cloaked man sidestepped, seized the stranger's arm, and with a brutal twist, sent the blade clattering to the stones. The next moment, the thief was on his knees, the cloaked man's grip like an iron collar around his neck. From where he stood, the boy felt a shiver crawl up his spine. Whoever this man was, he was not one of the master's regular enforcers. And the way the master's men moved to flank him, not with orders but with deference, made the boy realize this figure answered to no one but himself. The thief was dragged away, still breathing but beaten. The satchel, untouched, was returned to the boy. "Go home," the cloaked man said without looking at him. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of a command that brooked no refusal. The boy turned and began the long walk back to the villa, the image of the cloaked figure fixed in his mind. Whoever he was, he had just altered the balance of the master's dangerous game, and the boy had the sinking feeling he would soon find out how. The villa's storage cellar was cooler than the summer air outside, but it held a different kind of suffocation. The walls were thick stone, the light dim, the air faintly scented with damp wood and spilled wine. The boy lingered at the top of the stairs, just out of sight, listening. The captured thief was tied to a chair in the center of the room. His wrists were bound behind him, ankles lashed to the legs of the chair. A bruise was blooming along his jaw, the work of the cloaked man's grip. The master sat at a small table to one side, idly rolling a silver coin between his fingers. The cloaked man stood beside him, silent, watching the prisoner with a predator's patience. "You could have saved yourself trouble," the master said, his voice even almost casual. "You should have dropped the message and vanished. But you didn't. You ran. That tells me it wasn't for you." The thief said nothing. A thin trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. The master flicked the coin onto the table. The metallic clink echoed sharply. "Who paid you?" Still nothing. The boy could hear the faint sound of the thief's breath, ragged but steady. The cloaked man took a single step forward. No words, no visible threat, yet the air in the room tightened. The boy leaned closer, gripping the stair rail. "You are not in a position to bargain," the cloaked man said at last. His voice was low, deliberate, each syllable weighed. "You will tell us who sent you. You will tell us now." The thief laughed, a dry, broken sound. "If I speak, I'm dead," he rasped. The cloaked man crouched down until his face was level with the prisoner's. "You are already dead," he said. Silence stretched. Then the thief's eyes flicked to the boy's hiding place. Just for an instant. The boy froze, heart pounding. Had he been seen? The cloaked man noticed. Slowly, he turned his head toward the stairs. For a terrifying moment, the boy thought he would be dragged into the room. But instead, the cloaked man's gaze returned to the thief. "Who?" The thief swallowed, his resolve faltering. "A man from the upper harbor," he whispered at last. "Trades in grain. Keeps his books in a black chest." The master's coin stopped spinning. "Name?" The thief's lips trembled. "Demetrios." The master exchanged a glance with the cloaked man. A silent conversation in which the boy could read no meaning. Then the master leaned back, folding his arms. "And what does Demetrios want with my letters?" The thief hesitated, then shook his head. "Not your letters. Just one. The one marked with the red wax." The master's expression hardened. Without looking, he motioned to one of his men, who stepped forward and delivered a sharp blow to the side of the thief's head. The man slumped, unconscious. "Dispose of him," the master said flatly. Two men dragged the limp body toward the back door. The boy pressed himself against the wall, willing himself invisible. When the cellar was nearly empty, the cloaked man looked up at the stairs again. "Come down, boy," he said. The boy's stomach dropped. There was no point pretending. The man's voice left no room for refusal. He descended slowly, the stone steps cold under his bare feet. The cloaked man studied him. "You hear more than you should," he said. "And yet you are still breathing. That makes you either useful or dangerous." The master stood. "He's young. He's fast. And he knows when to keep his mouth shut. Most of the time, he might be useful." The boy felt the weight of their scrutiny. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat. The cloaked man nodded once. "Then we'll keep him close. For now." As the boy turned to leave, the cloaked man's voice followed him. "Remember, boy, you saw nothing. You heard nothing. And if you forget that..." He let the threat hang in the air. The boy climbed back into the daylight, his legs trembling. The name Demetrios echoed in his mind. And with it, the realization that the game he was caught in was larger and more dangerous than he had imagined.